Hello, and welcome to tonight's conversation. My name is Joshua Pater-Stuhlen, and I work at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation as the Assistant Curator of Public Projects and Engagement. This evening's discussion will focus on environmental racism, social justice, and the arts. It brings together Jordan Weber, Des Moines-based multidisciplinary artist, Inez Bordeaux, organizer for Close the Workhouse and manager of community collaborations at Art City Defenders, Michael Allen, senior lecturer in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis, and Jeff Ward, professor of African and African American Studies in Arts and Sciences at Washington University. Jordan Weber is currently an artist in residence through a collaborative project by the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, CRE2, the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, and the Pulitzer. Weber's St. Louis residency focuses on social and environmental justice, incarceration, and healing, with a specific focus on the Close the Workhouse campaign. This initiative is funded through an endowment created by Emily Rao Pulitzer to support collaboration between the Pulitzer, the Sam Fox School, and CRE2. For more information on how you can get involved in the Close the Workhouse campaign, go to closetheworkhouse.org. The campaign will be hosting a phone and text bank power hour this Thursday, March 11th at 1 p.m. You can sign up to participate via the link in the chat. There will also be a monthly movement meeting on Thursday, April 1st. You can email closetheworkhouse@gmail.com for the Zoom link to join this meeting. Special thanks to Liz Kramer, Tila Nagisi, Carmen Colangelo, Adrian Davis, Kara Stark, Kristen Fleischman-Brewer, Marina Peng, and to all the staff and faculty at the Sam Fox School, CRE2, and the Pulitzer. Thanks to Jordan, Inez, Michael, and Jeff for gathering this evening to have this critical conversation. There'll be time for questions and comments at the end of tonight's program. The program is being recorded and will be made available with closed captioning on the Pulitzer's website. I'd like to introduce Jeff Ward now, who will be moderating this evening's conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Josh, and to everyone at the Pulitzer and Sam Fox School and the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, and to our panelists tonight. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I thought a good way to get started would be to ask you, Jordan, to provide a little bit of context regarding your collaboration with Close the Workhouse and your residency at Pulitzer Arts. Could you just say a bit about how this came together?
Yeah, first I wanted to thank you guys for joining us as well, and to also thank the Pulitzer and WashU for the opportunity to start this residency. I can jump in with my relationship with Close the Workhouse, which started in the beginning of this year with an exhibition at the Luminary on the South Side. And the sole reason I participated in that exhibition was to try to build some sort of relationship with leaders of Close the Workhouse and Arch City Defenders, so we can hopefully build and activate a larger project than what happened inside of the exhibition space. And that's normally how things in my practice start, to try to push exhibitions inside an institutional space into a community space that will have some sort of benefit.
And Inez, maybe this would be a good time to ask you to weigh in on the collaboration and also maybe this where things are with Close the Workhouse. I know it's a fluid situation, but would appreciate some context you'd provide as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So for the people who have not heard of the Close the Workhouse campaign, the Close the Workhouse campaign started in April of 2018 to close the Medium Security Institute that's located out on Hall Street, about 12 minutes from downtown. The Medium Security Institute is known as the Workhouse and has been known as the Workhouse for decades. The original Workhouse was actually over on the south side of St. Louis, not too far, about a mile and a half from where I sit right now. It was built on a stone quarry, and the workhouse is exactly what it sounds like. If you owed a debt to society, or you owed a debt to someone, you could go to the workhouse and you could break up rocks to pay off your debt. That institution was closed, and the workhouse in its current iteration was built, I think, in about 1963. The name didn't change, and the conditions inside of the workhouse, even going all the way back to the original workhouse, have been consistent. It's always been a place of inhumane, unconstitutional treatment of people who are sentenced to that facility. And in its current iteration right now, it is a living, breathing monument to white supremacy and racism right here in St. Louis. And we know that to be true because in a city, St. Louis, that is 49% Black, the people that make up the population inside of the workhouse are 90% Black. And that was one of the founding reasons of this campaign. If you are Black in St. Louis, you either have been to the workhouse or you know someone who has been to the workhouse. And that is because, again, it's a living, breathing monument to white supremacy and racism. And the workhouse is allowed to live and thrive here in St. Louis because of the existence of cash bail. So those two things, the existence of cash bail, the fact that people literally have to be able to purchase their freedom in order to get out of that building once they've been accused of a crime, and the fact that 90% of the population making up the workhouse are, like I said, majority Black, poor people. So this campaign is really all about this idea that you may have heard a lot of lately: re-envisioning public safety. What does it mean for us as people who live in the city to truly be safe? So our demands with the Close the Workhouse campaign have really been very simple, and they haven't wavered in the 3 years or almost 4 years that this campaign has existed. It's one, close the physical jail. It's infested with rats and roaches. There's black mold growing on the walls. The water smells funny. It's the people, the staff inside of the jail don't treat people who are being detained with the dignity, humanity, and respect that all people deserve, even people who have been accused of crimes. So that is one. The second thing is ending cash bail. Like I mentioned a moment ago, cash bail is the reason why the workhouse exists. The workhouse, people inside of the workhouse, 99% of the people in the workhouse are being held pre-trial. That means they have been accused of a crime, but they haven't been convicted of anything. They are literally there pre-trial. And the reason that they are still in the custody of the city is because they are too poor to buy their freedom. The Constitution says that every single person, regardless of what they've been accused of, has the right to fight their case with the least restrictive means possible. That means people should be able to fight their cases from home. But because the way the bail system is currently set up, not only in St. Louis, not only in Missouri, but all across the country, poor, mostly Black, and other people of color are having to be able to buy their freedom in order to actually be free. And then thirdly, we want to do this idea, like I said, of re-envisioning public safety. What does it mean to actually make our communities safe? And study after study after study, plus a lot of common sense thinking, tells us that if you invest in people, if you invest in communities, if you give them the resources that people need to not just survive, but thrive, it does two things. It reduces crime. And when you reduce crime, you reduce violence. And that's what we all really want for St. Louis. We are a city that does have a crime problem, that does have a violence problem. And we don't fix that problem by continuing to invest in what is a failed arrest and incarcerate model. Locking people up, building jails, building prisons isn't going to fix any of these problems. Putting more police on the streets isn't going to fix any of these problems. If you want to reduce crime, you have to reduce poverty, and you reduce poverty through policy choices. Poverty is a policy choice that is being made. So if we can close the workhouse, we could take that $8 million that we spend on a hellhole jail every single year, and we can give it to people to help pay their rent, to help pay their bills, to make healthcare affordable, to make childcare affordable. By investing in job programs and education programs, we can re-envision what it actually means to be safe in St. Louis, and that's what this campaign is all about. And I'm sorry, I kind of get on a roll when I get to talking about the workhouse, so I'm going to make this next part really quick. The workhouse is only one of two jails in St. Louis. The workhouse is out on Hall Street, and CJC, which is right in the center of downtown, is a newer jail that was built 1995. We spend $25 million of our general fund budget on it every year. And the recent protests that have made national news all across the country, there have been 3 of them in the last 2.5 months. And the protests that have been happening inside of CJC put a spotlight on the things that the Close the Workhouse campaign and a lot of our partner orgs have been talking about, which is, 1, treating people humanely and with dignity, making sure that they have access to medical care, they have access to nutritious food, all of those things. And then on top of that, the extra burden and the extra burdens that come with living through a global pandemic like we are now. Court is not happening. Preliminary hearings are not happening. So that means people are sitting in jail way, way, way longer than they should be. And we got to see all of that with the recent jail uprisings, because the people inside of the jails were complaining about lack of adequate food, lack of PPE, cleaning supplies, not being able to go to court, not being able to have visits with their families. And so we got to see those uprisings blasted all over national news, all over the country, because people are not being treated humanely and with dignity.
Thank you, Inez. I think that's a very helpful context for talking about the interventions imagined by this residency, but also more broadly, this sets up nicely the question, what contributions can the arts, and this is something I want to direct to everyone and maybe start with you, Jordan, but what contributions can the arts and cultural institutions make to advocacy for reparative work in addressing racism? And how do we understand that impact? I think when you talk about, Inez, when you lay out these very dire circumstances, life-threatening and degrading and so on, it's challenging, but I think important to then ask, well, what do we get from the arts in response to this? And so I want to maybe ask you, Jordan, to say a little bit about your thoughts about the residency and the collaboration regarding the contributions, the kinds of impacts you're hoping your work will make.
Yeah, the impact I can start with first and foremost, because that's kind of why I've transitioned into a space where I'm making larger projects, and the impact of the arts. I think for one, can allow institutions and nonprofit organizations to gain greater vision nationally with some of the things that the arts can bring on a visual level. Although, as we saw, Inez just said, with the situation of the city jail, that visual of the protest spoke for itself. But in the arts specifically, I'm really interested in this idea of utilizing large institutions, arts institutions, to help the artist build something and act on behalf of the nonprofit organizations or the grassroots organizations the artist is collaborating with. And I think that one of the beneficial outcomes of that collaboration is simply access to large amounts of resources to take, necessary steps ahead in certain situations. And also, hopefully, the arts can help with some sort of sustainability aspect of a portion of that nonprofit or that organization in a long-term fashion, or like I said, sustainable fashion, that the institutions can continue to financially support. And I think that's extremely important in the arts and in my field of practice, to hold institutions accountable when we speak of collaborations, to make sure that they're really involved in these projects in a long-term manner, to help out the individuals being oppressed in a sustainable fashion.
Let me turn to you now, Michael. Same question. I mean, you have a background, deep roots in St. Louis in terms of landscape and urban history, and thinking about the politics of architecture and infrastructural space and heritage preservation work. What do you find interesting about and maybe useful about the kind of partnership we see here between the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, Close the Workhouse, obviously the artist Jordan Weber, and also the university, as you think about St. Louis and some of the issues you've been working on for many years?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the work that I do with the way in which the built environment stores, shapes, and encodes memory, which, as you mentioned, straddles the world of historic preservation and also academic architecture. But, I think historic preservation assumes a sort of neutrality to what it does as a field, and it's embedded in government, right? At the National Historic Preservation Act, local historic codes in the city. St. Louis has quite a few local landmarks and districts, and there's this assumption that everything is objective, right? And that the lists of historic buildings that someone like me would hand you are some kind of authoritative roadmap. And a lot of us for a long time have questioned that assumption, and have seen that, there's this huge gap in not only how we perceive what's important, but what actually has made it into the lists of sites that we think shape the fundamental understanding of where a place like St. Louis comes from. This gap that the Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trulot says is the gap between what happened and what is said to have happened. And I work in a field where we say what has happened, and we have to acknowledge that's arbitrary and contingent and completely socially shaped by the position of the person saying that, right? So when I look at this kind of an engagement and I see an artist coming in through an arts institution into a realm of historic memory and this long arc of oppression that's still not done, it's still not over and resolved, we're still working on liberation. I think this is an opportunity to look at the kind of work that I do in a different way. And, artists always show us that everything we assume to be true can either be a lie, a myth, or somewhere in between, right? And we need to think about that when we assume what's important to a city like St. Louis, what architecture matters, what places matter, and why they matter. that's all been conditioned and framed. And frankly, it's been conditioned and framed through a historic lens that is determined largely by white political and economic power.
You know, as you're describing this interest, it reminds me, I hope I don't, well, I'm just gonna, you know, I went to the St. Louis Art Museum this weekend and saw the amazing exhibition Currents 119 at Dana Levy, who's also, I think, had been connected to the Sam Fox School as a resident or some sort, put together that does a lot of this critical work that you're describing, and the piece that you are part of with Shiraz Gorman and Gwen Moore and others, I thought was just a powerful reframing of the relationships between time and space and the built environment. And I wanted to encourage the audience to take a look at that as you're and to appreciate how what the Pulitzer has been doing with this will be doing with this residency and has been doing with others is a part of, I think, a reckoning that is underway to some extent. By no means you know, a consensus, but there's a reckoning underway in St. Louis around, you know, the inheritance of structural inequality today that is rooted in the history of racist violence. And I think the arts in this city and around the country, and arguably and around the world perhaps, have been leading that reckoning in many respects. I want to talk about the, you know, Inez and all of you in some ways have talked about, in a way, this sort of politics of abandonment, and abandonment in a sort of humanitarian sense, abandonment in a moral, ethical, you know, abandonment of our sense of obligation to fellow human beings and treating people with decency and so on. And I was reading some work by Ruthie Gilmore recently, you know, who's been a key figure in the rise of abolitionism in terms of the mass incarceration. And she said, you know, we must expand and consolidate abolitionist antagonism to organized abandonment. And she's calling things like mass incarceration, things like the workhouse, organized abandonment. So many other examples of it. But I want to ask a specific question about the environmental racism focus of your project, and not just this project, Jordan, but others, and how you're also incorporating in your artistic practice, your design ideas, some attempts to counter the abandonment and associated harms that environmental racism poses.
Yeah, I've said this, and you guys have heard me say this probably a dozen times by now, but with environmental racism, I don't see any difference between environmental degradation of land and pollution of land and violence on land to violence on the Black, brown, and indigenous body. So, for example, you know, we see these cities in our region, North Minneapolis, North and East St. Louis, North Des Moines, North and East Omaha, South side of Chicago, where specifically Black folks are pushed into these neighborhoods that are heavily over-policed for one, but also heavily over-polluted from industrialization and factories that we are forced to live by and of. And an example is a project that I'm currently doing right now in Minneapolis, that we actually broke ground the day after the 3rd Police Precinct was burned to the ground with the George Floyd protests. But the specific project is to try to counter you know, land vacancies in these communities that are overly polluted with art mechanisms that mitigate pollutants out of the air. And in this specific Hawthorne neighborhood of North Minneapolis, there's a 300% higher rate of lung disease related deaths in that region that's predominantly Black than any other region in Minneapolis. So the idea is to, like I was saying before, put institutions on the line and try to make institutions have some sort of flesh in the game to build structures and art projects that will help in this overwhelming sense that I have of violence upon the body and violence on the land being one and the same. And I could probably talk and speak on other projects, but that's really what we want to focus on this project, and a lot of different ways that I'll speak to a little bit later once we get going on that.
Inez, could I come back to you now and ask, from your perspective as an organizer with Close the Workhouse, and, how do you see the arts and cultural institutions contributing to the changes we need? I mean, let's assume that the workhouse will be closed. I think we're moving in that direction.
We don't have to assume the workhouse will be.
The workhouse will be closed. And as you think about the long view here of repair and the future of St. Louis, for example, I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are about the importance of partnerships like this.
I'll be honest. Prior to meeting Jordan last year, I had not thought a lot about how the arts can help in these social justice movements. I had not thought a whole lot about it, but I remember sitting inside of the project that Jordan did last year for the Mythic Time of America. Like walking up and seeing a stoop that looked like, sorry, my dog is really excited. Walking up and seeing like a stoop, like so many stoops that we grew up sitting on, whether it was playing Barbie dolls or reading a book, and just having this wealth of information right there at my fingertips, and then being able to go inside of the exhibit. And I just picked up a book and I just sat inside with the soft light and the plants. And I was like, wow, like this is really something. Like, and I felt calm and at peace and just very, very content. And you don't often get to read about like abolition in a place that was built for you to read about abolition. And I get asked about justice a lot. As a person who's been impacted by jails, I've spent time inside of the workhouse. As a person who's been impacted by the criminal legal system, as a survivor of, domestic violence, I get asked all the time, well, what does justice look like for you? Like, what is justice? What does it look like to close the workhouse? Is that justice? What does it look like to demand accountability for the people who have caused harm? That doesn't look like putting them in cages. I spent a lot of time thinking about restorative justice, but I hadn't really spent any time thinking about like how art can literally just restore us. That 10 to 12 minutes that I sat inside of Jordan's exhibit, I felt a little bit of restoration there. And since meeting Jordan, I've thought more about what does it mean to use art to not just restore ourselves, from the harm that we've endured, but what does it mean to use art to restore whole communities? Imagine if we had something like that was available for the whole community, where they can feel restored after spending a little bit of time inside of a place that brought such peace. And then when I think about art and the ability to like impact or help move social justice issues forward, I've learned that art gives you imagination. And I know a lot about that. I spend so much time asking people to use their imagination, to dream big, to think big, to, imagine a world that you've never seen before, you've never touched before, you've never lived in before. And asking people to use their imaginations, we find that people generally lack imagination to think about things that they haven't seen before. And I think art gives the people an opportunity to do that. Sometimes people just need a little bit of a primer. They need something to kind of get started, to get the wheels going. And the more and more time I've spent with Jordan, talking to Jordan, and around, the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, I've gotten to see that it's a very powerful tool for helping people realize that they do have imagination, that anything that you can think of, you can build it, you can make it, you can make it possible. And that's been an amazing realization for me. And I can't wait to spread the gospel around.
That's wonderful. And, it makes me go back to your, to your, to your comments about the millions that can be moved away from the hellhole into other things. And when you were saying that, I was thinking partly about it's not really an irony, but it's an interesting point here, I think, which is that there are other, while there are these, obvious reasons to close, and I would argue probably demolish the workhouse, there are other structures that park spaces and but also built structures that I know, Michael, you've talked about being important to preserve for various reasons, including to create opportunities, not just in terms of the healing of bodies and minds and so on, but also to address the hoarding of wealth and the economic inequality in this community that is so bound up with the workhouse, as Inez was talking about earlier. And so what I'm getting to here is a question about historical preservation and environmental and social justice. And I want to talk a little bit about the Spring Church itself, which in just the Pulitzer, Arts Foundation's sort of site, which includes now Park-like, Inez, I was thinking of as you were talking about these spaces for healing and contemplation and relief of stress and so on. But these are also fraught issues in terms of the acquisition of property and public-private ownership and so on. And Michael, I wonder if you would say a bit about some of the challenges regarding, these inherited social institutional histories and responsibilities institutions like, Jordan, you've been talking about institutions taking responsibility. And I think Pulitzer sees itself as doing some of that. WashU as well, in terms of its attempt to be with and for St. Louis, more so than it has been in its history. Michael, could you maybe pick this up, and maybe I'm just curious what comes to mind for you as you think about a site like Spring Church and the possibilities, but also the tensions there.
Yeah, I think back to everything Inez and Jordan have been saying about environmental justice, because a lot of people, when they hear the phrase environmental racism, think about pollution, and that's a huge factor. But I also think about disturbance, which St. Louis's built environment really is a record of. Not air pollution, water pollution, although those things happen, but the fact that every attempt for Black settlement in the 19th and 20th century seems to be chased by bulldozers and urban renewal programs, and then now the kind of soft and slow neglect of North St. Louis, that's just horror unfolding before our eyes, but nobody seems to think that, back to your question about wealth, it's like there's a whole half of the city that doesn't know what's happening, the other half or doesn't seem to care. So, that church conjures all of that, because I think about the last church congregation in there, the National Memorial Church of God in Christ, that They were in there in 2001 when the building caught fire, which is why it's, ended up in the state that it has. They had bought that building in 1956 after being chased out of the Mill Creek Valley, the largest Black neighborhood at the time in St. Louis. 20,000 residents, over 800 small businesses, 2 newspapers, a Black-owned bank, real threat in a lot of ways to the economic structure of St. Louis, because Mill Creek Valley is where self-determination is really being born. It's also a threat politically because that's 20,000 people. That's a lot of votes, and that's an issue we're still dealing with. But they're chased out when Mill Creek Valley is entirely bulldozed, starting in the 1950s into the 1960s. And if you go to the site where they were before, it's a vacant lot. It's the street's still there, the lot's still there. It's just grass, just right south of Market Street, west of Jefferson. So, the fact that this congregation was able to find a new home in what had been a very, exclusionary white upper class neighborhood before the 1950s. That was a great thing for this church. That building carries all of the intentions and memories that go with that period. It also carries, of course, its earlier chapter, because that building dates to 1884, and it was built by a white Baptist congregation that was founded by a man born in Kentucky, William Yeaman, whose brother George Yeaman was one of the members of Congress who flipped his vote from against to in favor of the 13th Amendment, but nonetheless still held the view that white people were, biologically superior to Black Americans. So it's this, sort of fraught belief system that somehow they could do good while holding these terrible beliefs. So all that's there, that's a thicket that reminds us of a lot of things, a lot of trends and achievements, but also this unresolved sort of system of disturbance that St. Louis represents. And Parklike's a great example, I think, of a creative solution that embraces the kind of fragmented environment, sort of almost a ecological kintsugi, to put the city back together. The church is a tougher project because, one of the goals here is to put a plaque on the church, a plaque on the site next door where Theodore Link, the architect of Union Station, once lived. But plaques, again, are saying what happened, right? Other people know what happened. They lived it, including that lived account, not just the people who went to that church, but everybody who knows anything about St. Louis that has some connection to that site, right? Because that site touches on Black history, on Mill Creek Valley, on Midtown, on the Pulitzer itself, which is now old enough to have an institutional history. So this is a work that I think we're still thinking about the right format and output, and maybe what's tangible is just a small part of the ultimate program that has to happen there to really own and push forward the knowledge of all the stories embedded there.
One of the things that excites me about the collaboration between, artists, the social justice movement, organization, the university, is that it opens up so many lines of investigation and of creative practice and of organizing that I think, contribute to it sort of stages a larger conversation than I think is typically the case with museums and artists working in a more kind of closed way and then presenting this exhibit to the people. But related to that, I have a question. I'm mindful of the time. I want to stop soon to open up for more dialogue. So I want to end with a final question that I'll put out to all of you. And there's no good answer to it. I'm just curious about your thoughts. I know, Jordan, I'll start with you. The question of sustainability. There are great, brilliant, provocative interventions that happen, and then they kind of just go away. And one of the things I think we're often we often are asking ourselves, how do we keep this energy and how do we keep the momentum in light of the reality that history kind of moves in circles and there's always this retrenchment, kind of backlash and pushing. So how do we keep and I wonder, Jordan, just in terms of your work, how do you think about this problem of sustainability, the sustainability of your intervention? Or what strategies do you have in terms of, or were you thinking about in terms of making the work you do in a city like St. Louis or somewhere else sustainable?
I think the key, and I can sit here and speak on sustainability, but a lot of my projects are, 6 and 5 and 2 years old. So, that sustainability question, it hasn't even been answered in my work in a lot of different ways. But I think if you are in a position where you're not from a city, that you really should be focusing on the people and on the organizations that have been doing the work and that are going to continue to do the work when you're gone, obviously. And an example would be is the mothership. If you have this institutional project that takes place in a space like Spring Church, and it's got this exciting visual and it's got programming that can allow people to or give access to things in St. Louis that can help people on a financial, physical, and mental status. If you can move that, that structure or that program to a space like North St. Louis community spot, I think that you are more apt to have some sort of sustainability, because that, for one, like I was saying before, it adds a lot more of a focus on that organization's work, but then they can continue with this large art piece that, hopefully gains attention on a regional format that will allow attention to stay on that organization and in that topic. So that, I think, is the main goal of my practice too, is to not come into a space and have some sort of like artist project that has nothing to do with the community around it. It's about the artist. I really think it should be the opposite of that. And the artist is kind of sliding in and helping magnify the work that people are already doing, and they leave, and then that work is better for it in some ways. So
And you mentioned
that's a tough question.
You mentioned the mothership. Could you just say what that is for our audience that's not aware?
Yeah, Joshua, are you still on here too? Because I shouldn't even be speaking on the mothership's programming, because I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that they have had a stall on their community garden and the Ville neighborhood because of a building being knocked down next door that has toxic dust floating around their lot that they have, and I think I just spoke completely on it. So I think they're at a standstill, and we're actually meeting up with them, Samaya, specifically March 15th or 16th, to speak on the situation over there. But it's one of quite a few really great urban gardens happening in North St. Louis.
Great. Why don't we open up now for dialogue, Q&A from our attendees. I'm grateful to have, about 200 people in attendance. I'll start with a question from Mallory, who asks, how can art and artists impact policy regarding environmental racism? And I think you've alluded to that in some ways, but if anyone would take a specific stab at this question, how does art translate into policy change around the conditions that lead to environmental racism?
I mean, I can take it since I'm the artist, but I think I did speak on it a little bit. But you hope to have the greatest amount of impact with the programming and the actual structure of that art practice or that art project to ignite that sustainable, approach to policy change. And it's hard to even think about how much joy that would bring in the individual artists if they can really affect policy change in a meaningful way. So that's kind of the gold medal, right? To have that that project or the totality of your practice really change the built environment in a given city. So again, another good question, and I don't know if anybody else wants to speak on it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think artists are vital for public policy because artists have huge imaginations and politicians usually don't. They see what is, they don't see what can be, which makes it a lot harder to push for change, right? So artists in these conversations inject the imaginary, and all liberatory politics needs the imaginary because we haven't actually lived in the world where we've resolved all this, right? So if we're just sit here trying to compose a new world out of the pieces that surround us, we'll just find we have the same world, and that's maybe it's not politicians' jobs to be super imaginary, but I sure hope artists are part of public life and keep pushing because we do need to see the future, and artists take us there.
I had a similar thought, as someone, a sociologist who studies social movements has in the past. I think of the arts as contributing to one of the vital elements of movements, which is the formation of an oppositional consciousness and an understanding of a problem that needs to be addressed. And part of the challenge here is, with respect to environmental racism, but other forms of structural violence and racism, is unlearning the indifference, what I talked about before as abandonment, and creating a new potential for solidarity, so that you can understand not only that it is important in terms of the interests of others, but the ways in which we are kind of collectively implicated, impacted adversely, and so on. I think the arts can open, you call them imaginaries. I think philosophy, other fields do the same thing, is give us a basis for a kind of realistic utopian vision. Another question we have is
Hey,
from,
Jeff, before we move
go
off
ahead.
of that too, I wanted to comment because my internet cut out and I was just getting the love from Inez on the kind of the moment she had with that art installation at the Luminary and how she never thought of the arts impacting the situation at the workhouse. And that's that key moment that, I wanted to add as well, is if you can get individuals in a space where they're activated mentally and spiritually in a different way that pushes them in a direction of creativity, I think that's a huge win as well. So, when Inez was saying that, my thing literally gave out. So I'm gonna have to ask her when we get done with this to give me that love again, because that really excited me to hear that she reacted to that installation in a way that allowed her to think and absorb the arts in a different manner that can activate space-time in a different way.
I'm glad you came back to that. I was also really moved by Inez's reflections there. And Inez, I'm going to come to you with a question from the audience. A couple of people asking about the status of the Close the Workhouse campaign. And Elise Mack asked if you, Inez, can speak to the details of the vote in 2020 to close the workhouse, and what it will take through the arts or otherwise to ensure that the jail is actually closed.
Okay, so for a little bit of context, in July of 2020, there was a unanimous vote by the Board of Aldermen to close the workhouse. And if you know anything about St. Louis City politics, if you've been paying any attention, you know how big of a deal to get a unanimous vote to close the workhouse. I don't think I've ever seen the Board of Aldermen vote unanimously on anything ever. So getting this unanimous vote was a big deal. And this did not happen like in a vacuum or a bubble. That unanimous vote was the results of really 2.5 years of organizing, 2.5 years of base building, of calling, tweeting, texting, showing up at City Hall, showing up at events, emailing, blowing up inboxes, and so on and so forth. It was really intense 2.5 years of organizing that led to that vote. Since then, the Board of Aldermen, mainly people who already opposed closing the workhouse, people who we know did not stand with us, have backtracked since that vote. The ordinance that they voted on, it's ordinance 71217, said that there needed to be a plan in place and that the workhouse needed to close by December 31st of 2020. What those aldermen who have backtracked and stood in opposition and slowed down the process have said is that they didn't vote to close the workhouse. They voted to make a plan to close the workhouse. That's not what that was. I read the legislation quite intensely. It was a vote to close the workhouse. It did require a plan, but the Lyda Krewson's administration did not fulfill their obligations in order to make sure the workhouse closed on time. And because the Board of Aldermen, at least half of them didn't support closing the workhouse to begin with, there was no oversight requirements that the board put in place. They haven't held this current mayor's administration's feet to the fire in getting it closed. So here we are in March of 2021, the workhouse should have been closed and we should already have $8 million to invest in our communities to help address all of the problems that St. Louis has. So where we are right now, where the campaign is right now is, right now, we're in the middle of municipal elections. We're getting ready to elect a new mayor. Half of the Board of Aldermen is up for re-election with our general election happening April 6th. And then what will happen after a new mayor is sworn in is the St. Louis City budget cycle will start. And that is where the Close the Workhouse campaign is going to put the majority of our efforts. In order for the workhouse to close, it has to be defunded through the budgeting process of the city. And so that process starts in April. And right now we're gathering volunteers. We're continuing to base build so that we can turn out for all of these E&A meetings that are going to happen between the new mayor, the president of the board, and Comptroller Green. We're getting ready for all of the Ways and Means Committee meetings and Public Safety Committee meetings that are going to happen around the budgeting process. So that is where we are right now. The campaign isn't going anywhere. We're absolutely in this fight for the long haul until the jail closes. But right now, our focus is about to be on the money. If you can strip the money away from the workhouse, if you can strip the money away from this failed arrest and incarcerate model that is happening in St. Louis, we can then have that money reinvested in our communities. But first, we've got to take it away through the budget cycle.
Thank you, Inez. And I wanted to just note for our audience, that they're part of the movement against mass incarceration and the prison nation and so on has focused on toxic prisons. And Inez mentioned the water smelling funny in the workhouse, but we know from around the US that numerous carceral institutions have been built on landfills are sourcing what are known to be contaminated water supplies that not only affect incarcerated populations, but people who work in these institutions. And this is another example, I think, of this abandonment. But I wanted to mention this so that people who might be thinking, well, how does this seems like an unwieldy set of things together, environmental racism and the workhouse and so on. I wanted to mention that they are so deeply intertwined. The toxicity in both the kind of environmental contamination sense, as Michael was talking to, but also toxic in a kind of ideological sense about some people being fully human, fully deserving of dignity and respect and the recognition of their human and civil rights, and others being less than fully deserving, and so on. So many interesting questions. I want to turn now to a question that asking anyone who can respond to this, I asked you to. Do we have any examples of cities who have successfully engaged the arts and artists broadly conceived in a sustained way to address environmental racism? And even if we don't have proof, that it's all been taken care of, are there any encouraging signs, at least, of cities where this has happened?
I can speak on one specifically because I see Roxanne O'Brien on here. Roxanne O'Brien, I just want to give Roxanne O'Brien a shout out. She's up in North Minneapolis, and she was instrumental in the project and just dropping knowledge on us with the environmental justice movement in Minneapolis in general. But another an example of a project that has really worked is Seitu Jones in St. Paul, Minnesota, who does not get enough shine in the environmental justice realm or the public arts realm in general. But he has Frogtown Farms that he built, which is, I think, over an acre wild prairie, indigenous prairie grass restoration project in Rondo, St. Paul, which also has this giant community garden on it as well. And I think, sorry, my light keeps shutting off in my studio. Oh, I messed up my video. And that's one of the best examples, and Minneapolis and the Twin Cities in general are really key in the arts for granting and giving money to sustain these types of projects. And if I think Joshua just sent a link to it, but if you guys haven't seen or heard about that project, I really think you should look it up when we're done. And it also does a really great job at integrating the Dakota land recognition and the Dakota tribal community into that project consistently, which is a huge gap, and I think in a lot of community-based projects throughout the Midwest specifically.
Anyone else want to mention examples, or I can move on to another question?
I guess I'll just toss out Mel Chin's work a few years back in New Orleans with the lead crisis in housing. Look up Operation Pay Dirt, his $100 bills, imagining what that money could actually go to fund. It's worth a look. Comes to.
Thank you.
And as well, Mel Chin did started the arts in terms of remediation of lead, like Michael just said, with the Pig Eye Project, which was also in the Twin Cities and St. Paul. So yeah, Mel Chin is a huge guiding light for a lot of people in our practice in the arts and environmental justice.
I want to, Jordan, go back to the question of sustainability. Well, not necessarily about per se, but I know you're interested in working with students. Part of what interested you in this residency is the opportunity to engage with students, not only at the university, but in other contexts as well. And one of our questions asks for any advice for art students who want to bring awareness to environmental racism, including on campus, particularly when addressing the institution itself. And I don't know which institution they're referring to, but maybe you could, if you have any advice related to your own journey as an artist, or how you could share maybe how you've worked with students to help them connect the arts to issues like environmental racism. I think this would be helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the main things you have to do is make the project visually striking enough to make them want to get involved in the project for one. So when we talk about collegiate students versus high school and middle school, I really have a background in working with middle school and high school students, and um, especially with kids that wouldn't uh, be involved in the arts at all. And what I mean by that is, I come from a very sports related background where in my neck of the woods in North Des Moines, sports are the main focus and nothing else really mattered. So um, if you can make these projects relate to them in a way visually, I think that you are more apt to get them involved in the actual project long term. And as far as the college student, I think it's really important that they just spend time with the projects and volunteer as much as they can and get involved in these types of projects. So for example, this one, when we start working on the actual architectural construct of the project, if that's what it is, that they bring friends and speak on it in class when they go back to class, and then speak on it in their hometowns, especially if they're practicing artists as well. So I think it's really easy for college students to get and stay involved in these projects if they just have the resources to get to the projects and get information on the project itself.
I want to open the same question to you and Michael, and it's about engaging, and I'm just going to broaden it out from students to stakeholders and more generally, and young people, old people, how one of the questions we had that I think was very important is sort of alluded to, notice is that while this is compelling work, it's often the case that those most impacted are not present or not a part of the conversation. And also that those who are in positions of greatest power and influence, including politicians, are not apparently engaged. I wonder if I'll put it this way: if you could speak to Michael or Inez or Jordan, if you could speak to the question of how do you what kinds of things can we do to activate projects like this further so that they reach and move a broader and empower a broader swath of the population than perhaps we do typically. Are there ideas you have, or examples you would point to of ways that might work?
Yeah, so the Close the Workhouse campaign is a grassroots campaign that came from the people. Like the people demanded this. In the start of this campaign in 2017, there was a historic heat wave in St. Louis. And we once again made national news for all of the wrong reasons. There were people hanging out of windows, waving shirts and towels around, begging for help because there's no air conditioning inside of the workhouse. And so if it's 110 degrees outside, it's 125 degrees inside of the workhouse. And that's what those people were experiencing. And so this campaign centers impacted people. It's made up of people who have been not only impacted by the workhouse, but impacted by jails, prisons, and the criminal legal system. That's how I came to be an organizer with this campaign, because I am an impacted person. I spent 30 days inside of the workhouse in 2016. And so that is one way. You go to the people, and whatever project that you're working on, if it's grassroots, if it's a project that begins with the people, that automatically makes it more sustainable, especially if you are centering those people. Those are the people that are always out talking, sharing their experiences. One of my favorite ways to get people engaged and keep people engaged is to make them angry, because angry gets shit done. It's a motivating factor. I say anger is a renewable energy source, just like the sun. You can tap into it anytime you want to. If you look around at what's going on, we can talk specifically about the workhouse. If you're angry that people are poor and if you're angry about the criminalization of poverty, because that's what's happening with the workhouse. People are poor and they can't afford to buy their freedom. That's criminalization of poverty, and that should make you angry. And anger is catching, it's contagious, it's renewable, it's motivating. So whether your issue is you want to close a jail, or you want to do something about the lead that is poisoning our children, or you want to do something about the air quality, or you want to do something about the fact that the unhoused community is underserved severely in this city, all you have to do is look around, get angry. And every time you feel like you don't want, or you don't feel like, or you're tired today, think about those impacted people on whatever issue it is, and let that be a motivating, driving force for you to get involved. And then also what I like to call spreading the gospel. Anytime anyone invites me to come talk about abolition or closing the workhouse or re-envisioning public safety or investing in people and communities, I take that opportunity to go out and spread the gospel of this work. You've got to spread it far and wide. And again, it's catching, because there is someone out of the 208 people that were on this call. There is people on this call who are going to take the words that I've said, who've listened to Jordan and listened to Michael, and they're going to decide to get activated just because we were here spreading, the gospel.
Thank you, Michael. Let me give it to you for our last word, then I'm going to close it out.
All of that. And I just wanted to say, as somebody who's here because I'm part of an institution, Washington University, I think in this day and age, institutions really ought to, before galloping in and saying they're part of the solution, also take inventory of the ways in which they have inflicted harm. And, I'm teaching the architecture school, love the architecture school. There are connections, though. The Team 4 blueprint for triage that led to a lot of depletion in North St. Louis was written by students, came out of our master's program in architecture, right? The street closures and barricades came from a faculty member, back in the 1960s and 70s. Washington didn't allow Black students until 1951, the last major school in the university in town to do that. So, we also are responsible for repairing those things. And, we might have great ideas and great projects that bring other people in to work with us, but we also, I think, owe the community some act of reparation for all of that, and also acknowledgement. That's where we have to really start. And it's not just Washington University. I could say this about almost every university in the country.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate that point, and I think it's a good place to end. This is really just the beginning of a partnership, a residency, a project, intervention, a series of interventions. I believe this will end up being, and I'm excited to see. I'm excited to see it come together, and also to find ways that I can be involved in part with the reckoning that you're describing, Michael, as another WashU faculty member, but also as someone who, as a resident of St. Louis, inherits the inequality, the structure of inequality in St. Louis that is rooted in this history of violence we've been talking about, and that I think we're all committed to finding ways to address. So I want to thank all of you for this conversation, and thanks again to the Pulitzer and to the audience that has joined us this evening. There's been a lot of information in the chat about projects and initiatives that have been mentioned. So encourage you to, those who are interested, to take a look at those and keep exploring.
And if we didn't get to any questions that, on that thing, like I was looking at them as well, please don't hesitate to reach out to me as well. I'm not going to give my email out, but can you reach out to Joshua Stallin at the Pulitzer? He'll give you my contact info, because I really like to continue some of the conversation that was on the Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, unless Joshua, you have something else, I will say goodnight and thank you to everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, all. Thanks.
Yeah.